Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at Thor and Hulk. Unfortunately, I couldn't review these characters when the anniversary update and discounts were still on, since I was focusing on the Century video at the time, but I'm obviously taking a look at them now. I'm mostly focusing on how much of a difference the new uniform makes relative to their previous uniform, and then based on the results, you can judge for yourself whether you want that uniform depending on whether you want the character to be better in PvE, like World Boss Legend, ABX or ABL, or PvP. The reason I mention this is because the uniforms aren't a clear-cut upgrade in all cases. They might perform better in certain game modes, but not necessarily as well in other game modes. And similarly, if the character becomes better for PvP in certain instances, they might also have some pretty glaring flaws with the new uniform that you might not necessarily want to get because it might expose them to a lot of counter teams and overall make the character more vulnerable, even though they might be more useful in certain aspects that you want them for. First character that I'm going to be taking a look at is Thor. I pretty much only tested him in PvE since he doesn't really have the toolkit to excel in PvP. He does have an iframe on the 5th skill, which you could potentially leverage fairly well with a CTP of Destruction since he opens with that in things like Alliance Conquest and Timeline. However, I have built him for PvE exclusively with a brilliant CTP of Rage, and as you can see from this image, I was able to get to rank 1 with that build. Because my build is so stacked, I had to go to a high stage of World Boss Legend, otherwise I would have completed the fight too quickly and I wouldn't really have been able to see the difference between the old uniform and the new one. With the old uniform, I was able to reach the 4 health bar mark before I ended up dying. He can definitely complete this stage, especially with my setup, but I basically got to the 4 health bar mark with about 25 seconds remaining with this uniform. With the new uniform, I was able to reach that same 4 health bar mark almost 2 minutes faster, which is a crazy improvement for World Boss Legend specifically, and essentially makes Thor one of the best characters that you can use for World Boss because of his access to all the various different restrictions and stages that he can get into. Just for reference, I have an equally stacked build on Odin, but have a brilliant judgment on him since it tends to perform better in World Boss, where I used him most, and Thor with his new uniform and the brilliant Rage ended up performing about 30 or 40 seconds to a minute faster than Odin did. In terms of the build option for PvE, you can't really leverage a CTP of Energy or Destruction that well with the new uniform since there are a lot of delay cancels. A CTP of Rage is likely his most ideal option since it's very easy to use. You can spam the other skills, you don't really have to worry about procs. However, with this new uniform compared to the old uniform, pretty sure that you can leverage a CTP of Judgment better, especially if you have a reforged one, because he moves around so much. You could potentially fill out the top proc much easier than you could before, and it could make it a lot better with this uniform compared to the old one. People didn't really use Thor in ABX or ABL because he isn't meta. For the people that do use him, just keep in mind that when I tested his old uniform compared to the new one, I found that his old uniform did perform better than the new one because mostly the 4th skill has more hits, and because you can layer on multiple skills that you can kind of delay cancel or cancel. So you can do something like the 3 canceled into the 5th, which you then delay cancel into the 4th, so that increases the number of hits or the chain hit damage, and for that reason he does end up performing better. I was able to score around 13 million with the old uniform, and with the new one, because you don't have as many hits on the 4th skill and you can't really layer multiple skills on top of one another to increase that chain hit, I was only able to score around 12 million. I could probably played it a little bit better, but you can see that the difference is definitely there. I did notice that in ABL this does kind of change a little bit. It seems that in ABX the number of hits is more favored, but in ABL the amount of damage that these skills do is also factored in more heavily. So I was actually able to score higher with the new uniform in ABL specifically, though I might have played him a little bit better with the new uniform when I tested him there, so you have to take these results with a grain of salt, and the difference likely isn't as drastic, about 600,000 score, as you see in this comparison. Keep in mind that the new uniform doesn't really change his status in the ABL meta, since Gladiator is still the top option for the Alien Hero Day. His performance in Giant Boss Raid does improve with the new uniform, though it isn't really a reason in itself to get him for that. It's mostly for his improvement in World Boss Legend. And for his rotation, you basically just want to use 5, you delay cancel after he goes up in the air and the animation starts. Then you do 4, you let that play out. Then you do 3, and you weave in the 1 and 2 cancel to fill up your ultimate faster. When you have your ultimate, you basically do the 5, delay cancel after, again, the animation appears, quick cancel the 4, and then go into your 6th skill, then continue the rotation like before. I would say that Hulk got more of an outright improvement with his latest uniform than Thor did. Thor's were more specific, whereas Hulk kind of improved across the board. The first test that I took him into was a stage 94 of Null. I have a brilliant CTP of Conquest on the character when I tested him, and with the old uniform I was able to complete the stage with about 2 minutes remaining. With the new uniform, I was able to complete the same stage roughly around 30 seconds faster, which isn't as massive of improvement obviously as Thor's was, but he does have plenty of other improvements across other game modes that Thor doesn't. If you want to use him specifically for PvE, then I would highly recommend a CTP of Rage, since you can also leverage him in ABX and ABL now and is potentially meta in those game modes. However, if you don't have that, you could possibly also use something like a double HP obelisk with a mini rage kind of proc. That should work pretty well too. I would say that his most drastic improvement with the latest uniform is in his performance in ABX. With the old uniform, I was able to score somewhere around 11 million. I didn't necessarily play him that great. I probably would have scored maybe 12 million at most with the old uniform, whereas with the new uniform, I was able to score nearly 15 million and pretty much reach all of the rewards on the list simply using a CTP of Regen at the time. And even with a CTP of Conquest, I was able to reach pretty much the same thing. So if you do end up using a CTP of Rage, you can easily get that score and even higher with the character and potentially make him the meta for ABX and ABL on your list. The main reason why he performs so much better with the new uniform is because he has that endless attack on the 5th skill that you can just stay in and rack up those hits, which is massive for ABX, as you saw in the Thor tests, how much of an improvement or difference the chain hit or number of hits makes in ABX specifically. With the old uniform, he doesn't have that at all. And with the new uniform, he is also much easier to play. All you have to do is just cancel all the skills and stay in your 5th skill, and then rotate into your ultimate every so often. Keep in mind that if you do use him in ABL, you definitely need something like a CTP of Rage for him to get that high score, because a CTP of Regen doesn't really cut it for the reason that, again, I mentioned in the Thor test. The number of hits doesn't play nearly as much of a factor, so you want to have that extra damage that you get from something like CTP of Rage. It's also worth noting that the new uniform does add shock to his kit, which allows him to have all of the cancel effects for all the different seasons in both ABX and ABL. In terms of his rotation, you always quick cancel the 1st and 2nd skill to fill up your ultimate faster, but the main rotation is to do a 4, cancel 3, cancel 5, and just stay into that skill. When you have your ultimate available, you use that only when you see that the 4th skill is left with 2 seconds before the cooldown ends, so that once you finish your ultimate, you can go back and do the 4, cancel 3, cancel 5, and stay into that. Keep in mind that if you don't have a damage proc, he doesn't perform nearly as well in all other PvE modes except for ABX. He obviously performs really well there because it doesn't depend on the proc as much. But regardless, even without a proc, I was still able to put up a pretty decent time with the new health status, I guess, of Giant Boss Ray Dormammu, and completed it solo within about 2 minutes. For reference, it seems that the new clear time for Giant Boss Ray Dormammu solo seems to be around 30 seconds to a minute if you have a damage proc on the character. Outside of PvE, I would say that Hulk's performance does improve in PvP as well. In these first 4 tests, I used a brilliant CTP of Regen, and you can see that that is definitely still viable. And then in the tests afterwards, I used a brilliant CTP of Conquest for specific reasons that I'll mention, and you can see how that compares to the brilliant Regen. I would say that the main differences with the new uniform compared to the old one is that with the new uniform, he is much more susceptible to reflect damage, since he doesn't have nearly as many iframes in his kit. That means that he can't hide from reflect damage, so if he's dealing a lot of damage outright, then a character like Luke Cage or Silver Surfer can potentially just make Hulk nuke himself, especially if he's using attacks that have that little aura or AoE around him. because as soon as a character spawns in that has reflect, he'll immediately just down himself. Besides that, the character does seem to be tankier and output way more damage than the previous uniform. The main reason being that the iframe ignore is now on the 3rd skill, and on the 3rd skill they also added that buff that gives him 50% increased health, which was previously on another skill that didn't have the iframe ignore, so it wouldn't really be used and he wouldn't really benefit from it much. But by it being on the 3rd skill now, he not only gains that 50% increase to his attack because he scales off of HP, but he is also tankier from it. You would think that his burst damage is worse because he doesn't have that 100% increase to damage on his iframe ignore skill anymore, but that isn't really the case. He opens with the 3rd skill that has the iframe ignore, it has the 50% increase to health, which also increases his attack, and then he immediately goes into the 5th skill, which has that 100% damage increase and is a continuous attack. So it ends up dealing a lot more damage because it has the 100% as well as the 50% on top of that, and because the 5th skill continues for a good amount of time, it ends up dealing more damage in the long run. You could also be concerned that the 5th skill won't hit because it doesn't have the iframe ignore. However, the 3rd skill does have super guard break, so oftentimes because it has the iframe ignore and the super guard break, it'll knock the opponent out of their skills, and then the 5th skill will connect and also has super guard break. You can also already see the difference that a CTP of Conquest makes versus reflect characters compared to the region that I had. You can see that in this particular fight and all of the subsequent fights after this, since those are done with a brilliant CTP of Conquest. In terms of his recommended build, you pretty much have 3 options to pick from. You can go with a CTP of Regen, a CTP of Refinement, or a CTP of Conquest. All of these synergize with his kit, and all of them have positives and negatives associated with them. The CTP of Regen is the most well-rounded option of these. It gives you guard break immunity, health, recovery, the hit shield, and the potential to stop the opponent's lockdown skills or their big AoE skills with that penetration on the top proc. The main issue with this CTP is that it doesn't really provide with any kind of super guard break immunity or protection, and considering that many of the metas in PvP have that in their kit, it is a potential issue. A reforged CTP of Refinement does resolve this issue since that top proc provides you with protection against super guard break. However, because the CTP doesn't have guard break immunity in it, there is also the potential that you could be locked down by other skills that have guard break immunity on them. This CTP can potentially make the character tankier, but also more susceptible to being locked down as the fight continues. The other thing worth noting with this CTP option is that because it adds so much extra healing, you have the proc that activates at the bottom that gives you healing, it does also make the character a little bit more immune to reflect damage, since if his health drops low when he's basically attacking a reflect character and having that damage reflected back to him, that bottom proc will activate and kind of help him against his own reflect. The option that I obviously went with was a CTP of Conquest, the main reason being that it provides you the super guard break protection that the Refinement does, as well as the guard break immunity that the Regen does, and it provides you full immunity to reflect, which is a big deal for Hulk, since this uniform, he's basically out of iframes and ends up reflecting a lot of damage back to himself, so by having that full immunity, it does cover him from that potential negative, which you can probably see from multiple of these clips, where he isn't dying to Silver Surfer as frequently with the CTP of Conquest. This CTP option is a little bit more dependent on procs for him to excel. It isn't like Regen or Refinement where he has that HP pretty much fixed and up all the time. You need the character to basically drop around 50% health for that HP to kick in. That not only increases his survival, but also his offensive capability, as well as the top proc activating for that burst damage to really spike. The CTP has more ups and downs in its performance because it is proc based, but I found that it was the most consistent overall because of the other things that it provided, like the super guard break immunity, as well as the reflect immunity. I know that a lot of PvP characters are recommended with a CTP of Conquest now, but I would say that Hulk does work pretty effectively with a Regen and Refinement too, so if you don't have many of the Conquests to go around, then definitely try using those CTPs out, since it's not actually a big detriment to the character. I wouldn't necessarily recommend using the character in timeline, mostly because Sentry is there and he will try to lock down Hulk pretty hard. But if you do want to play him on manual, basically the main skills that you want to rotate through are your third skill for that iframe ignore to get that HP increase that helps you obviously defensively and offensively, and the fifth skill to lock them down because it has that super guard break, as well as being a continuous skill, so you can do a lot of damage, but one of the skills that you want to actually use pretty frequently is the second skill. It also has super guard break on it. It is a pretty quick skill to use, and it also removes the opponent's debuffs, so you can basically keep using your other skills to lock them down by doing that quick skill to remove their effects, and obviously doing the damage on top afterwards. One of the main benefits of the new uniform versus the old one in Alliance Conquest is that now he opens with the third skill that does damage fairly quickly, so the burst damage is almost immediate with that iframe ignore, whereas with the previous one he kind of rotated around a little bit, and in the current meta with a lot of characters doing burst damage very quickly, he could potentially be knocked out of it or killed while he's kind of rotating around. Whereas for this skill, he basically does it immediately, and like I mentioned before, after he does the third skill, he goes into that fifth skill, which not only locks them down if they are kind of a tanky meta, but also does a lot of damage continuously. With his third and fifth skill dealing area damage and locking down multiple opponents, that means that you can pair Hulk with other characters that are kind of slow or have some kind of wind up. The fact that his fourth skill is also a massive AoE skill that can be cancelled immediately and does a lot of damage to the opponent because it gets layered on top of his other skills means that he is capable of bursting down some really tanky opponents. As you can see here, he does end up becoming a pretty consistent counter versus Thanos sets, which typically run Hela as a support. That doesn't really impact Hulk because he is a villain. The very obvious downside of the new uniform is that because he does so much burst damage immediately, but isn't in an iframe, that means that he can be very hard countered by reflect characters. So you can easily counter Hulk, especially with that old set where people used Gore, simply by running defenders because they all do physical damage. Hulk will die almost immediately, so the defenders are basically just left to deal with Gore by himself. If by some luck the Hulk managed to bypass that reflect damage, you could alternatively also use a strong character that has super guard break in their kit to lock down the opponent if they don't have Conquest, and obviously some supports to increase that burst damage. So in this case, I used Captain America because he has his self debuff. I don't really need to use a debuff leadership, and because he has a CTP of authority, that means that he can tank some hits and then gain even more damage with his counter hit. And I obviously used two supports, Nick Fury and White Fox, to really spike out that counter damage to the opponent. So basically, just to summarize, if you don't have the old uniforms for either Thor or Hulk, then these are obviously great additions to go with. For Thor, you're mostly just going to be looking at an improvement in World Boss Legend in things like dimension rifts, and as a striker he actually does become kind of worse with the new uniform because the old uniform had more hits on the fourth skill, so it did perform or does perform better as a striker and in things like dimension rifts if you still use him there. For Hulk, the main value with his new uniform lies primarily in ABX and ABL, as well as his performance in taking down some tankier metas in Alliance Conquest. So you really have to weigh whether you're kind of pushing for those ABX, ABL scores, and maybe you didn't have a good performer for the combat villain or human days, so you could pick up Hulk for that. Or if you needed more characters to take out some top metas in Alliance Conquest, then you can use him for that. But you do have to keep in mind that he is kind of easier to counter now with Reflect. So if you just wanted the character to be kind of an annoying character to kind of hold certain zones, then the old uniform should still be fine for that. It's also worth noting that with the new uniform, Hulk's striker skill changes from that fourth skill that had super guard break on it, 100% increased damage, and the iframe ignore, to now just being super guard break and the continuous damage. I want to say that this is probably a downgrade because that striker skill that he previously had with the old uniform was one of the top options for PvP. It did really amazing, locked down the opponent, did a ton of damage, and had a little bit of an AoE, so could catch multiple characters. And with this one, if they go into iframe, then they're basically not going to take any damage. So it probably does require a lot of testing because the fifth skill also does a lot of damage with his latest uniform, so it could potentially be pretty good, but I would probably say that the previous uniform was better as a striker. That pretty much does it for this one. I know that this video is kind of late since the discounts are already over, but I still wanted to put it out so that the information was there when other discounts come around a little bit later. For the next video, if I have enough time, I'll probably be looking at Ant-Man, and then obviously with Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch coming with the next update or the mid-month or whatever you want to call it, I'll be probably upgrading those characters since they'll have some kind of relevance in either PvE or PvP. Anyways, if you did enjoy this video, found it entertaining or useful, please consider liking and subscribing and possibly sharing it with others. Like I've said before, it can potentially help them out, and it definitely does help my channel grow so I can make more videos like this. As always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch my videos, so thank you, but the video is now over.